you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe I have the Iron Lady sing that part that we used to sing for the first 14 years. So she can give me that shrill voice that wakes me up and goes, holy crap, we're live on a podcast. Let's get to work. As always, refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Remember, you have to have 5 people in your downline on the Chris Voss Show. We're like an MLM, only it's free. Tell them to go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss, one of the TikTokity, and all those crazy places. We have an amazing story that's going to blow your mind today and educate you, move you, and if it doesn't, keep listening to the story over and over again until you get it. Listen to it about 20 times just to make sure you got every last word. He is the author of the newest book that just comes out. May 14th, 2024, R. Derek Black joins us on the show with us today. His book is entitled The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Antiracism. And he's going to talk to us about his journey, his cathartic move through growing up to be a white nationalist to becoming, well, we'll get into it. He is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Chicago. Since 2016, he's spoken to many audiences at universities, foundations, institutions, museums, synagogues, and churches. They received the Eli Wiesel Award. Do I have that right on the pronunciation?
Elie Wiesel.
Elie Wiesel. And a humanitarian award from the Anti-Defamation League. The Klansman's Son is their first book. Welcome to the show, Derek. How are you?
Thanks for having me on today, Chris. I'm doing
Thanks
well.
for coming. There you go. And just to make the clarification, I probably should have done this in the bio. Your pronouns are they and them, and that's why I'm pronouncing it that way. People in the audience are like, Chris is clearly losing it. And I can't spell half the time anyway, or read half the time. I'm the opposite of dyslexic. I'm what? This is no joke.
Hyperlexic.
Hyperlexic. There you go. Thanks for saving me as my joke bombed in my setup. So there you go. Thank you very much. So Derek, give us any .coms. Where do you want people to find you on the interwebs?
I hate the social media, but I feel like that is the main way to find stuff I post. One of the things about writing a book that really appealed to me was I am a very slow writer, putter-outer thinker, and I really appreciate the fact that I have been afforded a way to write exactly what I wanted to write and put it out there, and honestly, I'd like people to read the book.
There you go. Order the book, damn it, and read it. That's what he wants. No, I'm just without all the violence.
No, get it from your library. It doesn't need to be something you buy. Borrow it from a friend. I just think
read it, share it.
It's something I've thought about for years and years and years, and I've waited a long time to write it, and I feel really good about what it ultimately is.
There you go. Congratulations. It's a lot of work to write a book, and you pour your heart and soul in it. There's all the editing, the editing part, and now it's out, and so people are gonna see you in a different light as an author. It's really weird. You can be the most successful man in history, and everyone goes, well, "That's kind of nice," but when you put a book out, people go, "Oh, you must be smart." It's funny. When I put mine out, I fooled everybody. They're like, you must be smart. I'm like, you guys bought it. But I'm sure yours is intelligent. Mine isn't. So give us a 30,000 overview of what's inside your new book, The Klansman's Son.
It's a memoir, which I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. And when I started writing the thing, I ran away from even biography at all. I tried to write something that was deeply argued, kind of academic, and it was a bunch of essays. Each one had a topic that I wanted to put out, and that was the first year. And then the second year was restructuring it to be something that was deeply tied to chronology and deeply tied to telling a story from my perspective. And I think both of those together is the really authentic thing that I wanted to describe, because everything I've learned has been this combination of personal experience and having the emotional impact and the relationships and the communities, and then having enough perspective to spend time researching things, talking to experts, talking to people who understood the context that I experienced firsthand, and trying to describe that and distill it into, here are the takeaways and the things that I've learned, but here's the context that I learned it in. And I've learned by putting this together that is the goal of a memoir. It's not just to try to describe an experience, but to see what is valuable in it.
And your experience is quite unique. Tell us about your upbringing, which ties into your book, how you were raised. I was just watching the Jenny Jones episode that you were on in 2001. Give us a rundown of that, what that journey was like.
Yeah, so I grew up in one of the central families that had founded white nationalism. Wow. And I also was born relatively late in their lives. So by the time I was born, they had spent decades trying to build that movement. And then I never had a moment when I wasn't deeply aware of growing up in South Florida in a relatively multiracial and a large Jewish population for a movement that was anti-Semitic and racist. And I grew up with people from all parts of this movement coming over to the house and being a really central locus trying to put it together. And it's not exactly what I think people might imagine. It wasn't rural. It wasn't explicitly isolated. I grew up in a relatively urban part of South Florida. I was across the water from Donald Trump's house, so I always was familiar with his antics and his giant American flag and his fireworks and his odd politics and loudmouth things, and all the other odd people who live in South Florida from a lot of different political scenes. But I always had this sense that we were a part of a movement that existed in every part of America, and people live in every place in the United States, and they don't look like anything, but they consider themselves a part of this movement, and that's what makes them a part of it. Their identities are based on the fact that they read the same literature, they have the same sort of central heroes and a sense of history, a sense of being a part of something that's 50, 60 years old. And my family were some of the most public, outspoken advocates who had founded the first web presence for white nationalism and really tried to create a big umbrella for it.
Wow. And, it's hard when you grow up because you grow up kind of indoctrinated and instilled in that. And like you say, you think everybody has that same journey. It's not a good example, but, an example I had when I grew up, my parents rented apartments and oversaw them in Hollywood. And so we lived around the block from some famous stars, and we'd walk the dog with them. And so I just thought everyone owned BMWs, Rolls Royces, and Mercedes Benzes. That's how the world worked. And so I can see how growing up in that environment, you just assume that this is the way you process the world. Now, your father was Don Black, and he was a former Grand Wizard in the Ku Klux Klan. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, he had gotten involved in the movement first with the Nazi movement when he was a teenager, and he had met David Duke on that same trip, and they were very close friends, and both went on to sort of help build that movement together, and they founded a Klan organization together and had both left it, not because of a change in their beliefs, but because they had decided it wasn't a good brand. It wasn't something that could create a big tent. It wasn't something that they could separate from violence and terrorism in the 1980s and 1990s, and they wanted to go into politics. And so by the time I was born, they had already made that shift. And to your point before, I don't think there was ever a moment when I was not deeply aware of the fact that my family represented a movement and an ideology that the rest of the world thought was just absolutely insane and hateful and wrong, on all these different levels. And my rationalization as a little kid, I can look at myself when I was 10 years old on TV talking about it, and it was that nobody else understood us. Nobody else got that we were not the bad guys. We were not hateful. We were not like that was the rationale. And that was the rationale they often told themselves, that they were the ones defending something. And that was also a big reason why growing up as a teenager, I spent so much time trying to rationalize why this community that I felt so committed to was something that I could see myself as not wanting to isolate myself, not wanting to harm other people, and still becoming a major figure within it.
And it's hard because, I mean, it's kind of all you know. You grow up in it, and you're kind of probably at an early age indoctrinated in a lot of this stuff. Now, I don't know if you want to touch on the Jenny Jones thing. It was interesting to watch. You were one of the early people to set up, a website on the web there, and do some of that. And I was watching the interview with you. Tell us a little bit about that part of your life.
Yeah, media and trying to get this message out was always still is a big part of how the far right operates. And so something that I was thinking about with the book was, if I didn't say anything about it, maybe the wise thing was just to not talk about it, not give them oxygen. And I think I wrestled with that for a while and realized that it's not about just giving them oxygen. It's about not giving it without context. And that was what my dad had always been trying to do in the 90s. I'd seen him giving interviews. I'd seen people coming over to the house. And I believed the ideology as well as I thought I could, as a 10-year-old. I look back and I have a lot of sympathy for being 10 and realizing that it doesn't matter how many times an adult asks you, are you sure you want to do this? There's no sense of context and consequence. And I just wanted to be somebody who my parents, I think, felt proud of. And seeing this opportunity to try to be outspoken and go on national television and advocate this ideology felt like something that was genuinely exciting. Like, we went up to Chicago for the first time, and I'd grown up in Florida. The producers paid for me to go to Disney Quest with my dad, which is this 1990s virtual reality theme park that was in the Loop in Chicago. And it was this just kind of thrilling trip, and hearing the audience cursing and yelling, and I even though I had this separate interview, it really instilled this idea that just other people don't get us, they misunderstand who exactly we are. And also it made me feel like I had taken a step onto this self-identification that I didn't have any way out of. It wasn't that I was necessarily trying to. It wasn't necessarily for the years that followed that I realized, this is wrong and I just want to escape or something. And, eventually this story goes into college and I really had to wrestle with that. But even then, it wasn't something that I felt like I was wrong about. I spent all those years going to these academic conferences that white nationalists put on, talking to highly controversial tenured professors who argued that race was this biological real thing. And I tried to solidify myself with the idea that I had facts on my side, that for as bad as it felt, it was true, and truth should be the most important thing. That was what I told myself.
And that's an interesting lesson too, in how sometimes we believe that things are true because we feel very deeply about them, and it's hard to see outside of that ego of what we believe is our truth. Maybe, does that sound about right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to give away the ending, but I did eventually go through years of this community at a liberal arts college that condemned me. And my reaction to that was not initially, I must be wrong, because I feel committed to you and this community is telling me I'm harming them, therefore I need to stop, because I thought I had all these facts. It took years of dealing with really looking at the evidence and realizing how bad the facts were. And at the end of it, it's where I got to that place where I recognized, wow, it is not that nobody's told me racism is bad. Nobody's told me it's wrong and incorrect. It's that I wasn't willing to sit with it or listen to it or think about it or really interrogate it because my identity was at stake. And that was the real lesson that I had at the end there, that it's not that facts are not deeply important. It's not that rigor and truth is not really something that we need to engage in. It's that our ability to even look at what we think is true. And it's not just somebody who grows up in, sort of far right, strange ideology. I think to some extent it's true for everybody. Our ability to even assess, why do we believe what we believe? What do we consider true? What facts are we willing to even see as being contradictory to what we believe is based in the fact that if I seriously change my mind about whatever thing we're talking about, I will likely lose the community and the people I care about and the relationships and the sense of who I am that comes from that. And I think when we recognize that, we see why changing your mind, is such an understatement when we're talking about something fundamental to who we are as a person.
Yeah. You said that so perfectly. Our identity, and it's really hard to change your identity. I mean, I've had to change my identity when I've, had businesses fail, and my identity was wrapped up in those companies, and that this is who I am, and then 2008 caused a lot of crisis for a lot of people. But yeah, identity, and you described that a lot of us, we do confirmation bias, regardless of what we believe in, and so we build that in our identity and in the security around that identity. I must be right because here's the news of what I found, some batshit website conspiracy or something, but it must be right because I'm being confirmed by my thing, and people do that. If you buy a red Porsche, you start driving home on the freeway, your brain starts doing confirmation and going, hey, look at all these red. It starts pointing out all the red Ferrari or the Porsches, and you're like, oh, I have made a wise decision because look at all these other smart people. And what was interesting, there was the other thing about what you said where you were trying to talk to the community there at the college, et cetera, et cetera. I think I saw a little bit of that in the conversation with the Jenny Jones show where you were talking about how you were getting beat up at school and harassed at school. Was that you also at the same time trying to educate those people as to who you were or what the movement was about? And you really felt like kind of it was a more of speaking your truth, but also trying to let people know that you weren't evil or bad. You were just, here's how we think, and you must be misunderstanding us.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely how I saw it. And I try to sort of separate out my feeling of growing up within it from people who are drawn to racist movements. Like, I don't ever want to give myself an out or anything, and I don't even mean that here. I think I take a lot of I do take a lot of responsibility for the fact that I grew up in a movement and a world that I accepted as a child. But there's a certain point, when I needed to take responsibility, and I did eventually, but I was 18, 19, 20 years old and was still thinking that this is something I believed. And that sort of rationale that they told themselves, that I told myself, it takes a lot of holding a bunch of different things that are contradictory and just not really examining them. And the fundamental one, the one that broke down for me, was the fact that you can't hold both beliefs that I wanted to be open to other people, I wanted to be somebody who didn't harm people, did not, at the very least, was neutral, but hopefully made other people's lives a little better. Like, that was something that I cared about, particularly, and I looked at it in retrospect, people who I knew and cared about and who were a part of my life. And that was what drove me as a young teenage and adolescent white nationalist activist, because I became very outspoken. I became a national speaker. I eventually ran for office. I ran a website. Like, I did all these things that I could see myself as standing up for this community that I cared about. And I could also rationalize and say that, I wanted things at some kind of high level. I didn't want harm for other people. And the rhetoric within white nationalism often says that and tries to claim like the line between their politics or their arguments that it's not about superiority or hierarchy, like that these things are separate from the massive violence and the terrorism and the fear that comes out of this movement. And eventually, I had to look at the fact that there's just no rationale here. But the reason why was because I was suddenly in a community that I had formed these intimate relationships with, and I was hearing people who I knew, respected, cared about, and who probably just as importantly knew and cared about me. Like, they knew who I was. They knew that I wasn't, like a personally scary person or a dangerous person. They knew that I was a good friend because I had spent a semester on campus without telling people my background, and we had made these relationships, and that wasn't new for me. I think I often thought I could just have both worlds, and the people would maybe accept it once they found out. But when they didn't, I just was faced with this: where's the misunderstanding? Is there some way that I can explain how I don't see myself as harming you, And it's sort of embarrassing that it took years and years of wrestling with it, but I take some sympathy, and I think that it's just genuinely incredibly hard to look at the fact that you need to fundamentally change what you're doing because it's at odds with everything else you say about yourself, at odds with your values, and it's going to cause this loss. I can look back on it now because it was over a decade ago that I condemned white nationalism and recognized, wow, that it felt like walking into a void. It felt like it was losing every relationship that I'd built up until I was 21 years old, including my family and most of my intimate family members, and see just how dangerous and how blank that feels. It sort of felt like going into not having a future. And so for somebody who thought that they were driven by facts and driven by evidence, it was kind of painful to get to that place and realize, wow, okay, it was about community and connection and identity. And I eventually looked at facts, but I didn't want to because I didn't want to lose those feelings.
Yeah. It's interesting how we take belief systems, and sometimes, from what I've studied with belief systems, I'm no scientist, but I grew up in a religious cult, and I kind of went through my journey too, where around 16 or 18, I had to say, hey, I just don't want to do this anymore with you guys. This is your thing. I don't think this wants to be my thing anymore. And the reaction was probably some of your families. But we take like a belief system, just something you might believe. There's aliens walking around in government. Okay, you take that and you start wrapping all those confirmation biases, and then it becomes that identity thing. It becomes like this whole wrapped piece of ball of yarn, and trying to unpackage that whole onion, if you will, that you built is so hard to do because there's so much in there, and there's so many belief systems you pile on top of it that support it, and you feel like you're losing a part of yourself, your identity. And then, of course, what happened when you wrote your letter denouncing white nationalism with your family?
I mean, it was something I hadn't warned them about. They knew that I'd been withdrawing for years before that, 2 or 3 years of college before that, but they didn't realize that I felt so firmly against their ideology that I felt like it was harmful, hurting people, that I needed to speak out against it. I couldn't just be silent about it, especially because I had been so outspoken in favor of it. And their reaction to that was immediately disconnection. It wasn't full. My parents spent a week talking and having these really hard, dark conversations about whether it was possible to have a relationship going forward. And I would argue, there's clearly family relationships here that go beyond politics, and then my family would come back and say, what about our lives have ever suggested to you that we maintain relationships that are not in line with our politics? And to their credit, they decided that week that both my parents wanted to have some kind of relationship, but most other people in my family didn't, and definitely nobody in the movement. It's not like I was trying to, but this sense of in and out is so fundamental to a movement like that, and it was painful, and it was embarrassing for a long time to even realize that I rely so much on this feeling of being a part of something that I should have never been able to rationalize. Like it's that sort of feeling that now I can look back and say there's no such thing as should. You do what you can, you learn what you can, you make the choices that are the next best choice in front of you. But like that feeling of not being able to see how contradictory what I was absorbing was to who I wanted to be in the world and what else I knew about the world. It really shook me. It made me feel like for a while afterwards, it was like I didn't know how to make choices for a minute. I was like, how can I know confidently that something I believe is something I believe? How do I answer that question? It was a very strange sort of dark moment when I did not speak out publicly for years after that. I went into grad school. I studied medieval history. It was something to really occupy me. And it was this feeling like I don't know how to trust myself. Like I don't know how to even decide what it is that I am and what I do. And that was something that was really disconcerting.
You're breaking down into a cathartic moment where your identity is erased, and then you're like, who am I? And I mean, that's from the sounds of it. You wrote in the book about how your mother ended every call with "I love you." And then the week you published the enunciation of abdicating from white nationalism, she wrote you back and said, you need to make new friends and family. What was that like?
No, it was really rough. It was really hard. It was harder than I had anticipated, actually, and I think that was probably self-protective because it was predictable. Like, my family were very, very clear. Even going back to when I was a kid, speaking out on behalf of this, I never saw myself as trying to win their love or something. It's not how I thought I was acting, but it was also clear I was growing up in a movement where that was their passion, and being a part of it was the most sure way for them to love and trust and respect me and think that I was, somebody worth paying attention to. And so it was kind of predictable, but it was something that I just had not been able to wrestle with before making the choice. It was like I felt like I had to make the decision because I had spent years after I came back to college in this community that was, speaking out against me, and sort of split between trying to ostracize me, saying I didn't belong in this community. They wanted to prioritize people who felt threatened by white nationalism, and people who said, oh, maybe we can change, Derek's mind. And I'd spent years in that setting and had lost my feeling of the evidence. I had lost my feeling of moral rightness bit by bit, not thinking it was going to undermine who I was, not thinking it was going to undermine even this identification as a white nationalist. And it was really only at the end where I just had, okay, there's no rationale, there's no defense for it. I don't believe this. I can see that I don't believe this. I can see that they are willfully ignoring facts and they're not willing to change their minds. It's about the ways they see themselves in the world. I need to therefore do something because I feel like they are hurting people and I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And, it was like I felt, but I don't want to. I want to be somebody who has my community, who my family cares about and loves and trusts and sees as the next generation. Like realizing, I wanted to be an important person to the people I cared about, and I can't. And there's not like you just switch to another community. It's not. I'm not sure what your experience was exactly, but I've talked to a lot of people over the years, and I think religion is often an experience that people have, like very, very intense family religions, and it's never the case that people had the experience where they were like, here's the other place I go. It's often the case that they had made connections with people that made them realize they wanted to go somewhere else, but that's not the same thing as, I'm going to disconnect from everybody who cares about me and, plug in over here. It's something that I went into just this feeling of, I don't know what my connections are. And it's taken over a decade since then to one by one sort of build relationships, think about who I am. And at this point, I feel deeply connected and deeply meaningful in who I am and my identity and what I want to do. It's, for the most part, like anybody, relatively clear. And I don't have this sense of, oh no, who am I? But the fact that it took years and years and was so really challenging, I try to emphasize that as not an aberration. And I know my experience is unusual. I know my experience is unique and all this. But the idea of radically changing your mind on something plays out really similarly every time. It's that feeling of this is going to be incredibly hard to rebuild who I am. And it's not something that we should think is so easy or light, or obviously people should do it, If they realize that they're a part of something that's bad, they should just leave it, and do what?
And like I said, that ball of yarn, that identity that's so wrapped up. Some people don't even know where to start pulling the string at because there's so many belief systems built on it. Now, your journey is kind of interesting too. We mentioned your they them pronouns. And one of the things that you go through is exploring and trying to understand your gender identity in the LGBT community. And of course, with many of the folks in the white nationalist movement, they're not too excited about the LGBT community from what I understand. Tell us about how that's a part of the book and how you go through that journey as well.
Right. It is not extremely explicit in the book. I talk about it a little bit, mostly in the epilogue, and it's been sort of a little bit surprising how much emphasis there's been in some of the articles about it. And I'm not unhappy about it. I think it's good because at this point I really am ready to talk much more about it. But I've been writing the book for several years. And during that period, I was like, at the beginning, I was like, this is personal. This is not something I knew I ever wanted to talk about. And I got to the place where I'm like, I never contradicted or avoided in the book, but I didn't want to get explicitly into it because it was the book that I wanted to write about racism and identity identity. And at this point, it feels very odd to be sort of relatively comfortable in how I describe myself and how I see myself, comfortable in the fact that I've had conflicted gender feelings since I was a little kid, and probably similar to ideology, absorbed the idea that, just because you want something but you can't have it, I sort of lost the feeling of what's the difference between wanting to do something and not being able to do something. Like, it must be that I didn't want it. And it's still something that I process over time. And being in college was also, an experience of recognizing that we do not have to conform. We don't have to present any particular way. We don't have to be anything. And a lot of structures we have and a lot of assumptions people have tend to sort of, often serve kind of some kind of power structure. I think, I'm not saying race and gender are all the same thing, but the idea of things being incredibly rigid. Whenever, I think I am willing to say, whenever an ideology or a social construct tries to emphasize how absolutely rigid a category of body or person is, and there's absolutely no transgressing it, and there's no fluidity, and there's no permeable barrier between these categories, it's never true. And it's also often serving some kind of power, some kind of structure, some kind of ideology. And I think that's something that I really had to unpack over time. And the book isn't about gender, but anybody who reads it who is interested in it, please recognize that you're reading a book from somebody who has lots of trans thoughts in most of these scenes and talks about it a bit at the end. And I have more things that I'm writing about it now and putting out now.
And I think that's what complicates the story and gives it more depth, more challenges in losing your identity, because you're going through several different evolvements at the same time of who you are, what you're about, flushing away what you were raised with racism and white nationalism when you're young, and you're trying to find out who you are as a human being who's not a racist, who's not a white nationalist. You're trying to understand your sexuality and your identity there. I mean, that's really a complicated journey to go through. And I think those sort of stories are important because there's probably people out there that may be going through something similar. Maybe they're only going through one of the journeys of those two that you went through. But, you can kind of help give people a blueprint, a guide print to, maybe how to cathartically move through those things. We always talk on the Chris Voss Show about how people's stories are the owner's manual to life. And usually when we have people on the show who've gone through their cathartic moments, their journeys, and they figured out the blueprint as to how to survive that and come through it. It ends up helping so many other people that are like, someone told me a long time ago, they go, somebody needs to read your book. There's somebody out there, probably a lot of people that need your book, and they're not gonna get it until they read your book, and you're gonna save them from whatever sort of thing they're struggling with. But they need you to write that book and finish it. And so I think, there hopefully will be people that read your book. I'm sure there will be. And they'll be like, hey, I'm going through the struggle right now from whatever those two venues are. And your leadership in saying, this is the way I got through this, can give them a blueprint for getting through theirs.
I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. I hope so. I'm glad that I waited till now to write it. It was because it was a decade ago that I condemned my family's movement. I felt lost for a long time, but it wasn't too long after that I think I had the opportunity to, and I was really happy that I didn't. I said no and didn't know if I ever would get the chance to, and hoped that at some point I would understand more what I wanted to write. And at this point, I can look back on it and say, yeah, I basically understand what was happening in those times, and I basically have a lot more understanding and compassion for myself. And so I'm glad that I'm the version of myself, who's telling people about what I experienced.
And by showing people that example, if they're going through that, or just as a learning thing, I think, like I said, we all have confirmation bias. We all build in our biases. We all believe that the news channels we subscribe to are the correct ones, and what we're reading. And I've seen people, they watch CNN, which I watch a lot. We've had several of the CNN people on the show. It tries to cut it down the middle as best they can. When someone's doing a crime wave, they're going to talk about a certain person a lot if they're on a crime wave, and that appears to be biased. But there's certainly other news channels and other consumptions. I've talked to people that are deeply into conspiracy theories, and even ones that you would seem logically implausible, like JFK is still alive and he's running the government, and you're like, he would be like 120 years old or something. I don't know what it would be. Seriously, you're going with that? That seems a little... that just seems so implausible, but, so do most conspiracy theories. But I think it's a good example of where you've gone through the journey, and maybe it can shine a light to where other people can go through the journey, whether it's understanding their sexuality or whether it's dealing with racism, and it's sad that racism is taught at such an early level. Someone asked me, how do we beat racism? And I think it was me and Eddie Glaude Jr. were talking the first time he was on the show. We were talking about how to beat racism. I think it was him or it was somebody. And we were like, we need to change laws. We need to, change redlining. We need to do all this stuff at this higher level when people are adults to fight racism. And I remember I told them, I said, what we need to do is we need to fight it in schools and at the child level, because that's where it's being taught. It's being taught by the parents of the children. And, by probably the time they enter school, they're already indoctrinated in what the parents have taught them. And so somehow we need to fight that at the elementary school level, the junior high school level. What do you think about that? Is there a way to combat that? So if we were to look at you as a 10-year-old child entering school, was there some way we could have, do we fuck up? Do we miss out on trying to help you through it? Or is it something you just had to go on this journey?
Oh, I've got a lot of answers to this. Baseline, I think, I'm not sure I mentioned it, talk about it in the book, that my family did take me out of school when I was 9. And I think the baseline is this recognition that they were worried about my being close to people who were contradicted our worldview. I was somebody who wanted to be open to other people, and I think they recognized that that's not the worldview they wanted. They want isolation was how they tried to practice their lives. And so probably certainly being in school, my life would have been different because of my relationships, but I don't know how. It's probably telling that college was the time that I was closest to people for the first time since that point. And it was also the point when I most radically rethought my worldview. And so I think school itself, being close to people who aren't like us in any setting, and not just school, at any point in your life. It's not just about being young. It's about any point in your life being very close with other people who are not just mimicking what you say and what you believe and have your values and sort of understand your context, and you're all sort of trying to stay connected in that way. You're trying, in any setting like that, where you are equals, where you really stay in each other's spaces for a long time, you have to reconcile those distinctions and differences. And if somebody says, this is something that you fully misunderstand about me, and your response is like, I care about you, tell me more about it, that's the moment when we really start rethinking what we believe and who we are. And on a fundamental level, how do we decide what is true? That's the time when we make those decisions. And I think it can happen at any point in your life. The general lesson I think I took from this experience of coming to that community, leaving the one that I had grown up in, condemning it, realizing I've been wrong. I had that moment I was mentioning earlier about wondering, how do I even decide that what I believe about anything is true? It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it was this feeling like that. And where I landed, the general idea was that as long as what I was valuing was always trying to expand the circle of people that I cared about, trying to find a larger constellation of relationships, even if it's just one that I'm thinking about, not a person who I actually know, just thinking about how can I imagine that I'm connected to that person that I've just met or heard about or know somebody who knows somebody. And if my worldview allows for that, if I'm always trying to sort of expand the relationships that I have and how I feel connected to people, then the ways that I'm assessing, how am I affecting other people? How am I judging what is true? How am I making sure that I'm consistent with my values and myself? That's something that doesn't steer, I don't think, anybody wrong. This idea, especially if you think about it the opposite way, whenever we're trying to rationalize something, when there's something that maybe in the back of your mind makes you wonder about how you are actually acting in the world, like how you're actually affecting other people. It's the opposite of that heuristic. It's the idea of, I'm not responsible for that person. If this thing that I need does seem to put them in a bad situation, like somebody else needs to look out for them. I'm looking out for these people, and this is not my problem, and I can't be blamed. And like, you start saying all these sort of things, and it's something that I think we all are tempted to do and feel, and it's an important part of being alive. It's a bit overwhelming to think there's no end to your connections to people. It's not just the people you meet day to day, it's everybody in the world at some point. And how do I deal with that fact? But the moment that you aren't willing to do that, you start rationalizing things and you start losing yourself. And I think that's really the lesson that I tried to take with me. It's difficult, it's hard. There's never an answer. I always feel a bit inadequate thinking like that, but it's something that I can make sure that what I'm saying, what I'm doing, how I'm acting, at least is consistent, at least is who I want to be. And even if it never feels like enough, it's at least always a step towards feeling like I'm living the life I want to live.
There you go. It sounds like you're seeking a true, authentic self of what the truth is, and you're still on that journey as you go through it, and trying to, I went through a similar journey with my cult where I was trying to, I'd been isolated like you were, where everyone is evil, stranger danger. That's actually how the cult operates here in Utah. Mm-hmm. It's still to this day, and you can't trust the outside world, you can't talk to the outside world, you can't get that outside perspective, but then when you go out, it takes a long time to unwind that yarn ball of all the different things. I mean, it's been 40 years since I officially left, and there's probably still an imprint that has on me. And then family, of course, losing your family, or the thoughts of losing your family is incredibly challenging, and I've actually had to deal with that because I still have family members in the cult, and so I still deal with them pushing the cult. At 56, it's a little old. Yeah. So I feel you, man, and I'm glad you went through this journey. I'm glad you saw the light. I'm glad you're setting an example and letting people know as a beacon that, hey, there's a better way, and here's the way out, and you can find your way to a better life, a better happiness, being more agreeable with the people around you, and joining humanity instead of isolating yourself into this ideology where you're like, we're better than you. The one thing that was interesting to me is when I had an epiphany one day that religion and ideologies really have this moral high ground that gives people this pompous sort of ego pump that we are better than you. And I never really understood that was what was going on, but it's a look down your nose and glasses that go, we are the moral high ground because we believe in, I don't know, space aliens, and you don't. So clearly, we are better than you. And I never realized that was part of it. It's kind of interesting, sort of psychology.
That is true. That's a really good way to put that. Something that applies to my life and applies to basically everybody who I've ever met who had some isolated upbringing and then left it. It's that feeling of the people on the outside are somehow not as good as you. Yeah. And all of us, we're the ones. We really care for each other. We're really important to each other. And those other people, they're not just, you don't have to worry about them. They hate you. And you're like, huh,
Yeah.
Realizing that's not true is very hard. It's like I don't know what it was about me. I sort of wonder sometimes if it was, I don't know, I was just inherently, I never wanted to isolate myself from people. Even when I was a little kid, I didn't want to tell somebody that, I can't be friends with you or something like that. Just wasn't, I rationalized it. I said, why nationalism has to be scientifically backed, or it has to be true about millions of people, but not about individuals, because I can tell individuals are not one thing. Everybody is a world unto themselves. I could see that when I was 10 years old. And that eventually was my unraveling, where this ideology that tries to explain how everybody is born to be something based on their race or whatever isn't true, because an individual, what's a community? What are millions of people, but lots of individuals? And I really am thankful I had that feeling, and I don't think it makes me better. I don't think it makes me like, oh, I was like, empathetic or moral or something. It was just this feeling that I didn't want to be cut off from other people, and that led to eventually, ironically, having to cut myself off from the people who most cared about me in the world. And I don't know, there's like a deep irony there. And also, I think I don't want to make myself, and I guess I think like everybody who has this experience, like case lessons or something, but the idea that it's easy to feel like you're going to lose the community that cares about you and tells you how dangerous the outside world is, and that, if it seems unreasonable, you should just do that. I think too many people believe that. Too many people think changing somebody's mind or persuading them is about telling them what they believe is wrong, and maybe the community around them is actually ignorant or something. And to believe that somebody's natural response to that would be like, oh, thank you for, telling me I'm a jerk, or telling me my, community and family are insane or something, like, oh, I'm so glad you've intervened. It's not how it works. The only way it works is to be a specific person in their life, to be a relationship that can talk to them, that they trust, that I trust, that, whatever the relationship is, and then say, I care about you either way, and I just want to talk about life, and I'm not here to change you necessarily, but I do think you're wrong, and I do think you should listen to me, and go from there. That's how persuasion works, and the reason is because it's all about relationships.
Yeah. There you go. And that's a good point. We live in a world now where everyone is at odds with each other, and we're highly politicized on both sides of the thing. White nationalism is a big part of the GOP now. And then, the left, we have our woke people that are kind of extreme left. They've gone so far left, they're supporting Hamas now, evidently, some of them. They've curved around the other corner. But, we need to talk more, and we need to build those relationships. I think your point about relationships is really important. One of the things, I had a conversation with somebody who's into a lot of conspiracy things yesterday, and it's just so hard to figure out where to start with them, because every time you talk to them, they will spout off to you 20 of the most craziest batshit things, and you're just like, how do I even try and figure out a way to have this person understand anything, how do we get to square one? And it's really hard. It's difficult, but I try and build a relationship, and usually when I have political discussions with people that I think we can have them, I set a foundation, and I say, okay, but here's the relationship part, as you've talked about. We're all Americans first. We're not sitting here having this conversation as you're a GOP and I'm a Democrat. We're not having this sort of thing. We're Americans first, and the great thing is we can debate, and so it kind of focuses on that relationship first, and by focusing on we're all Americans first seems to get me to better conversations.
I can see that. I think in my movement it wouldn't have worked, because white nationalists view themselves as not American. They view themselves as beyond nations and countries, and they see themselves as transnational, and so it would have been something where we'd have to say, they would be like, yeah, I don't care about America, would have been the reaction that they had. Like on 9/11, I remember my dad waking me up in the morning and saying they were attacked. Like this country was attacked, as opposed to, not us. And that feeling was, alarming in retrospect. But there's actually, I don't know if you have a minute, there's a point I did want to make. I was thinking about just listening to that, about this idea of crossing identities. And there's something that it's one of the observations I've made as an adult looking back on white supremacy and white nationalism, not something that they believe themselves, but I feel like it would have made sense even at the time to hear it. If I'd been a teenager and somebody tried to explain it to me, I would have said, it would have stuck with me, which is that they rationalize race, and they rationalize this hierarchies, and white people are smarter and more creative and all this sort of stuff. And they want to isolate themselves, so they want to segregate the whole country. And, they have this really horrifying vision of the future. But at base, they grew up in the same country as everybody else did, and they saw enormous inequality and enormous injustice. They, on its face, see that based on how someone's born, that's going to predict what sort of like life they have in aggregate, whether they have more money, whether they can go to college, whether the jobs and connections they get, like how the police treat them, whether they get in prison, like all these sort of things are very different based on what body you're born into and how you're identified racially, legally, structurally. And they see that the way everybody does. The same things that anti-racists say, oh my God, this is so unjust. We must change the structures of this society. We need to create a world that changes the ways this has all been intentionally built over centuries. And white nationalists weren't taking an inherently different conclusion. They were looking at that injustice and saying, I need this to be okay in some way. I need it to be the case that I, don't have a more comfortable life than someone else because I was born into some category and it's just a social injustice, a social crime, and this makes me feel horrible. They instead look at that and say, oh, it must be that I deserve, I am better than, like maybe, the stories are true. Maybe I really do deserve it. Maybe other people are worse than me. Maybe they have less or living a harder life because they're a worse kind of person than me. And, depending on your worldview, you could look at that and say, oh, that's insane or that's cruel or something. But the way there is about the same. It's just living in a world that's deeply unjust and coming to a conclusion that I need this to be rational. I need this to make sense to me. It makes sense if you sort of think about it. And it explains why racism is, why it exists. It's not that people are just inherently bigoted and just, hate people who aren't like them. It's much more that the world is structured in a way where they need things to not feel so bad, and they come up with a worldview to explain it.
And maybe that's a search for security or a search for, we all approach the world where we try and, it's chaotic, it's scary, it's madness, and we try and somehow give it reason, and we try and, I studied a little bit of this Stoicism, we try and give reason to catastrophe, and why are we here? Because we're here. Why do things happen? Because they happen. If I want to quote Neil Peart to Rush, and I grew up with a religious community that said, oh, the earthquake happened because, God, I don't know, he didn't have acids and he was upset or something, or he just, I don't know, he just woke up on the wrong side of the bed of a hangover or something. But, and the way we would rationalize all sorts of stuff, and really, it could be that the universe just operates the way it is, and that bad things happen because they happen, and there doesn't have to. But I think sometimes we build these models to try and rationalize and bring context to the world, because it is kind of scary to walk through the world and just think bad things can happen any time to you, and there's really no rhyme or reason to it. Have fun with that. You never leave the house, right? So it's interesting. But I love how you've done the psychology of this and going through your journey, and it gives a roadmap to people to kind of have a deeper understanding of why they're believing in things like racism or other beliefs, and then they can start unwinding that thread and saying maybe there is a better way, maybe there's a way outside of the box. So there you go. This has been a wonderful discussion, my friend. As we go out, give us your final thoughts and .com so people can find you on the interwebs.
Oh, I need to set up a .com. This is a good reminder. I've got one. I just don't have.
Let me get that book.com for you there.
Yeah, just search for The Klansman's Son. That's the title of the book, and there's ways to get it and look for it. And all I ask for people is just, if you're interested and curious and want to engage on this stuff, I do have social medias that I sometimes see if you post it, but mostly I put a lot of work and thought into the book, and that's where I really have invested my thoughts, and I'm really waiting. The book came out earlier this week, and I'm just looking forward, I think, both to critique and to just talking about it with people. I think I really have lived a life where I feel like ideas and trying to figure out how do we want to live is something that is communal, something that's based through conversation. You can't do it by sitting alone. And I really like engaging with people on it. And so anybody who's listening to this, who enjoyed this conversation, who, even if read the book or not read the book, but just like the idea of just trying to understand how we can live more meaningful lives, I think is something that the main thing that drives me at this point. How you can lead a life that you don't feel like you're lying to yourself in any way, like you don't have to have some sort of rationale to justify some relationship or some ways that you're connected to other people or way that you affect other people, and to understand how hard that can be. I think that it's not inherent that everybody wants to be an unharmful person who lives a good life, and like it is so much more complicated than that and so much more perilous and dangerous, and I think we just have to have a lot more sympathy for each other.
There you go. And I love that message. Have more sympathy for each other. We had somebody on recently who was talking about the third perspective and how we need to, recognize the humanity of each other and empathize with each other, like you say, as opposed to, all these tribes and identities we put up. I'm American and you're this, and I'm white and you're not. And when it comes down to it, we're all human beings, and we all should learn to get along.
Sure.
Can't we all just get along? The famous line. So thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a wonderful discussion, Derek. I applaud you on what you've done. I know how hard a lot of these journeys are to go through, of cathartic moments, rebuilding your identity and losing them, and finding your way through the darkness. But thank you, and thank you for providing that light for people.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's been great to talk to you.
There you go. And thanks to our audience for tuning in. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold. The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Antiracism, a memoir, out May 14th, 2024. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time. And that should have us out, Derek.